Contrary to popular opinion, the just war theory was not a Christian revelation. This was one of the staggering things that I found in researching just war theory for this teaching. I've been familiar with just war theory because of my teachings on peace, but I didn't really realize how insidious it is and how insidious it has been in the fact that many people are dishonest in teaching that somehow just war theory was like a revelation given to St. Augustine, or a revelation given to St. Ambrose, or a revelation given to Thomas Aquinas. When in reality, just war theory actually originated well before Jesus was born, right? So this isn't some sort of revelation that's given to the church. This is something that's already known well before Jesus is born on the earth. Just war theory originated in ancient Egypt. Okay? There's a really great article, and here's the link right here. You can see it on the screen, but what we'll do is we'll probably put a link to this in the description so you can actually go to this. You really want to read this, or you can just Google it, Expanding the History of the Just War, The Ethics of War in Ancient Egypt. And it's an article, but you can read the whole thing online. It's very fascinating. I'm just going to read you the first part of this. It says, this article expands our understanding of the historical development of just war thought by offering the first detailed analysis of the ethics of war in ancient Egypt. It revises the standard history of the just war tradition by demonstrating that just war thought developed beyond the boundaries of Europe and existed many centuries earlier than the advent of Christianity or even the emergence of Greco-Roman doctrine. Now, I like the fact that he uses the phrase Greco-Roman doctrine because that's really what it is. It's the doctrines of men. It's the traditions of men. So now we see back in Egypt that there was a just war idea, the idea of proportionality, the idea of fair treatment of prisoners, on and on. So we see this. Now, whether they kept it or not is not the point, because I don't know of anybody who actually keeps just war, and I don't think you do either. But they did at least understand that they needed to have some sort of model for this because they knew that it was wrong just to kill human beings. God has put that in us. He's put it in us from the very beginning. We know that when we kill someone, it's wrong. I mean, we all can't escape this. It's wrong to kill. We know this. And so if we're going to kill in war, it has to be justified somehow. It has to be justified killing. It has to be just war. Otherwise, it's just straight up murder. And so not only is this known today, it was known thousands and thousands of years ago because the human conscience has to deal with this fact. In China, for example, during the Warring States period underneath the Zhou dynasty, just war principles appeared in ancient Confucian philosophy. So you'll read about these just war concepts in ancient Confucian philosophy, okay? 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Aristotle, who of course is a pagan Greek philosopher, was the first to introduce this concept to the Hellenistic world. He was the first one who brought it to Greece. And he called war a last resort that could only be conducted if you were seeking to restore justice, and that's it. He says in his book, Politics, Book 7, the proper object of practicing military training is not in order that men may enslave those who do not deserve slavery, but in order that first they may themselves avoid becoming enslaved to others. We go on. In India, 300 years before Jesus is born, the just war principles appear in the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is the longest poem that's ever written. And this, of course, is these are holy writings in the Hindu world. But this is the longest poem that's ever written. And it talks, and this is 300 years before Jesus is here. And it talks about what? Righteous war. And what is righteous war? It has proportionality. It has just means. It has just cause. It has just conduct. Okay? So we have these concepts already in the pagan world well before Jesus is born on the earth. And they're not just coming from what we think is safe Greco-Roman, although that's not safe. But it's not just coming from Greco-Roman philosophy. It's coming from Confucian philosophy. It's coming from the ancient Egyptian philosophy. It's coming from Hindu philosophy. And then the greatest popularizer of just war even though Julius Caesar doesn't listen to it, comes from Cicero in the 1st century BC. He writes a book for posterity's sake called On Duties. And this was a favorite book, by the way, of the founding fathers. And it was also one of the favorite books of St. Augustine. We'll talk about St. Augustine in just a minute, but this book plays a major role for Augustine. So now in this book, we read about proportionality when it comes to just war, just means, just cause, just conduct. Okay? So this is not a revelation to the church. What in fact happens is that Augustine is enamored with Cicero. And if you've studied St. Augustine, you know this. You know that, in fact, if you know anything about St. Augustine, you know that it was because of Cicero that Augustine claims that he was saved. Because of this man, Cicero. He says that Cicero caused him to love philosophy, and that led him on a journey that ultimately led him to Christ. But it was Cicero who kind of launched him. And he always enjoyed the writings of Cicero. Even though Cicero was a pagan, they kind of considered him a virtuous pagan. This is what they called a virtuous pagan. So Cicero, who, by the way, did not care for the Jews, and probably he wasn't around when the Christians came. He probably would have felt the same way about the Christians based upon how he felt about the Jews for the same reasons. But Augustine is infatuated with Cicero, and he begins to literally regurgitate these principles for the Christian church. He begins to regurgitate Cicero's teachings on just war. Where did Cicero get these teachings? Well, they were in the Hindu writings, they were in Aristotle's writings, they were in Chinese writings, and they were in, now we know they were back even in ancient Egypt. This is a new finding. So this just war tradition goes back for centuries through pagan traditions. Okay? So Augustine, who is infatuated, yes, literally, with Cicero, and credits him with his own salvation, then regurgitates Cicero's understanding of just war theory and baptizes it. Here's what I want to say about St. Augustine. So I think St. Augustine would be horrified at what we have done with just war theory. I don't think that he deserves all the blame, but I do think we need to understand the source of how this worked its way into the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ. In his book, City of God, Augustine says this: a just war is justified only by the injustice of an aggressor. Okay, so when you read Augustine on this topic, you're going to find out that Augustine does not like war. He is opposed to it. He knows that war is wrong. He knows that Christians should not engage in war. He knows this. Like, this is not something that's unusual back then. However, now that there's a Christian emperor, and now that Constantine is in power, and now that the Christians have political power, and now that they have, so he begins to kind of explore the idea of maybe using violence, but only in very limited ways and only based upon the injustice of an aggressor. So to Augustine, war is bad. It's an evil. But there are certain times, Augustine says, when it may be justified. It may be justified. And when is it justified? When there's injustice from an aggressor. Here's another way that Augustine puts it. He says a good man would be under compulsion to wage no wars at all if there were not such a thing as just wars. Okay, well, that seems pretty reasonable. So you can see Augustine, that really distills down really his thinking, that he doesn't want war and that a good man would always avoid war. But if, because there's such a thing as just wars that have these criteria, well, that means that a good man could wage war if it was just. That's the thinking here, okay? Now, again, Augustine doesn't really see this implemented fully, and he's really only kind of writing about it, not realizing how big of a door he's opening up that later people are going to drive a Mack truck through, right? But at this point, he's just kind of saying maybe if the war is just, then maybe good men can participate in the war if the war is just. Okay? So this all kind of makes sense now to our thinking, because this is where we are today. We live in a world where it says absolutely. If the war is just, well, then we can go fight it, they say. Even the Christians, right? You go into the church and they applaud all of the military men who come in. Doesn't matter. You know, they think it's wonderful. So there's really no pushback at this idea because all the wars we assume are just. And because they're all just, well, it's completely justified killing. So there's no murder going on. Okay? So that's the way that it works. Over time, you have others that add to this. You see the greatest contribution after Augustine in the Decretum, which is a 12th century book that the Roman Catholics use kind of as a canon, source of canon law, kind of brings some of the, it's a legal book is what it is. But then the other really big contributor to the just war theory in the Christian tradition then becomes Thomas Aquinas, who lives in the 13th century, a giant of a theologian, writes the book Summa Theologica, and it's just an incredible work, incredibly long, incredibly detailed, and in it, he lays out 3 conditions. So he begins to kind of further develop the just war theory that has already been introduced now into the church from pagans. It's been introduced into the church, and so now Aquinas is kind of massaging it and kind of saying, let's kind of develop this further. And so what Aquinas does is he has 3 conditions for just war. For him, you have to have a rightful authority, right? You got to have a real declaration of war from a duly constituted leader. And then you would need to have a just cause that would be maybe injustice by an aggressor, which would fit the idea of Augustine. And then you need a right intention. Right? That is, you're not going to be disproportionate. You're not going to go and try to seek revenge. You're only trying to remedy the injustice. Okay, so this is Aquinas' 3 conditions for the just war. Okay, and here's what Aquinas says. This is from Summa Theologica. For it may happen that the war is declared by a legitimate authority and for a just cause, and yet be rendered unlawful through a wicked intention. Okay, so Aquinas lives in a time where war is much more prevalent than Augustine. And there's a lot of small skirmishes and wars and battles going on during Aquinas' time in the 13th century, as opposed to what's happening in Augustine's time. Augustine lives in a time of relative peace as compared. Now, to Aquinas, we don't get the idea from reading him that he thinks that war is inherently evil. We don't get that. So Augustine seems to pump the brakes really hard on war and say, no, this is evil. This is evil. We can only do it if it's just. Over here with Thomas Aquinas, it's almost become commonplace by now. And war is kind of common, and there's less taboo around war. And so now he's simply saying we've got to hold to 3. We've got to hold to these 3. And he points out that if you break one of them, then it's unlawful. And if it's unlawful, then it's unjust. And if it's unjust, then it's murder, right? So he's clearly saying these 3 criteria have to be met. Okay. So now we could go on and get into the weeds and look at what Martin Luther said, but we would run out of time. Look at what John Calvin said and look at all. But let's just fast forward now to the 21st century, because I think we all know, kind of how this works. I've put up a few people here, a few faces that you might see and know, whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant. These men here on the screen represent different faith traditions, all within the Christian community. You have, for example, for those who are listening by audio, I have a picture of Pope Francis, who currently is the Pope of the Catholic Church. Then you have Billy Graham, who is deceased, D. James Kennedy, who is deceased, Charles Stanley, very popular in the Baptist movement. By the way, D. James Kennedy, very popular in the Presbyterian movement when he was alive. And then you have John MacArthur and John Piper. And so these are very popular Christian teachers. Now, we would say, well, what do these men think about just war? Well, you can simply go to their websites or look up their ministries and find out. Now, it's not something that they're going to teach on often. And in fact, you aren't really even going to hear them teach what the just war theory is. Paragraph 2309 in the Catechism, you can read what the justification for just war is, and they have 4 principles. We've already talked about that. So there's the Catholic view. The Protestants also agree with just war theory, and they believe that that is how we can justify any war that the United States goes to. Now, what's strange about all of this, as I've stated, is that there's no reference to Jesus in any of this. There's no reference to Jesus in the just war theory. He's not referenced at all. As I continue to say, the just war theory principles could exist, whether Jesus is alive or whether Jesus is not, whether Jesus ever came to earth, whether he didn't come to earth, whether he existed or never existed. It doesn't really matter. The just war theory works in Egypt, it works in India, it works in Greco-Roman world, and then it works, of course, with Christians. Now, how it works with Christians is really what we're talking about today. We know that non-Christian states are going to war. Jesus says that you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. People are always going to war. James tells us, where do wars come from? They come from your lusts, right? They come from your lust for more, your desires, your wrong desires. That's where war comes from. So we have this concept today that there's Christian just war. And so anytime that there's a bringing up of this topic, it's almost default. So if you say, can Christians serve in war, to any of these men here on the screen, you'll find out that they'll say, well, of course they can, right? Of course they can serve in the military. Now forget the fact that they all disagree with the first 3 centuries. Forget the fact that, these men wouldn't be able to get into a church in the first 3 centuries with that kind of belief because it would be considered heresy. But today, all of these men believe that wars are justified because of the just war theory. Now remember, the just war theory is not a Christian revelation. God doesn't drop this into the mind of Augustine. Augustine gets this from reading a pagan book. Okay, this is where he gets the idea. He's like, well, this sounds good, so maybe the church can kind of use this as a template for when it goes to war. Well, here's the deal. The template for just war, when you look at it on its face, is actually really great. If you're going to fight a war, well, the just war theory looks like a great thing to be looking at, right? The question is how many wars are actually just, right? So which will you choose? Can we love our enemies by killing them? Let's see if we can make the just war theory that the pagans have used for centuries and for millennia, and they have developed, and Jesus' teaching, which, by the way, all these men will tell us that the Gospels are what we must follow, that Jesus is the one who we must follow, that his words matter most, and that above all human philosophy, Jesus must be believed. Okay, so remember that all of these men here on the screen, they would tell you that if you don't follow Jesus and do what he said to do and copy his life, that you haven't kept the Christian life, that you haven't lived the Christian life. But these men also tell us that the pagan ideas of just war tradition that go back for millennia, they also say that these are Christian. They say these are Christian. We have to choose here. My thesis here is that we have to choose.